Hello and welcome to Marketing Room 101, the podcast where I invite marketers to join me for a good old rant and I give them the chance to banish one thing from the industry forever. I'm your host, Ben Norman, Strategy Director at Principles, the agency that does unforgettable things for everyday brands. And for this episode, I have a really exciting guest, because for a long time I've wanted to invite a guest into Marketing Room 101 from a finance background. That's because I think one of the biggest issues facing marketers, especially in the current economy, is getting the backing of the CFO and the board to invest in their activity. Now, Ian is the founder of Liberty Sky Advisors and is an analyst and advisor to the media, tech and creative industries who spent over 20 years in the city as an equity research analyst specialising in these sectors, and is the only person to have been crowned CityAM's Analyst of the Year twice. What I love most about talking to Ian is just how clearly he sees the wood for the trees. Rather than getting stuck in the granular detail that marketers often obsess over, he sees the big global issues, trends and topics, and boils them down to exactly what they mean for businesses in the sector, and how that knowledge can bridge the gap between the marketing team and the boardroom. I thoroughly enjoyed this chat and learnt a lot. I hope you do too. Marketing Room 101.
Thank you very much, Ben. Nice to be here.
Thank you. So, Ian, can you kick us off, please, by describing this room to our listeners? What is it like in here, in Marketing Room 101?
I think the 1984 George Orwell 101.
Yes.
I mean, I would think my Room 101 would be locked in an endless meeting where people are just talking and going down increasing rabbit holes around data quantification, ever less relevant minutiae, and just completely ignoring the bigger picture and what exactly needs to be done. And that, for me, is unfortunately, there tends to be quite a few real life meetings where 100%. That happens. But I have a hatred hatred is maybe too strong. Well, actually, no, it's probably the right word. A hatred of meetings that essentially go on too long, have no clear defined meaning and end, and where you just finish off actually being in the worst position than when you started the meeting.
We've all been in that room, I think. We've all, yeah. and we will all be in that room again.
Indeed.
It's safe to say. I will applaud you for the seamless use of the phrase bigger picture there, because I feel like that's a perfect little plug for you to tell me about bigger picture and what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So just in terms of my background, I was an equities analyst in the city for 20 years. I covered media and tech. I was twice CityAM Analyst of the Year during that time. And then 5 years ago, I just decided to actually set up on my own and set up my own business, Liberty Sky Advisors. And my core product was the bigger picture. And the whole rationale about that is there's a hell of a lot that goes on in the media and tech sectors. But in order to actually really grasp what's going to happen in the sector, you often need to know what's also happening in the outside world. And this is why I say the bigger picture. What's happening in the macroeconomic side? What's happening on the geopolitical side? These things, particularly as we've seen over the past 18 months with what's gone on with the Trump administration, actually do feed down into the world that we inhabit, even though we think from a marketing standpoint, what's it got to do with us? And you can give examples of that. For example, what's happened with Facebook and the bans that governments are looking at in terms of regulation. You can do it in terms of what the Trump administration has done in terms of tariffs in China and how that's impacted the advertising market in the US. And so what I do is really bring together that wider macro view and then say what it really means for the media and tech sectors, and then bring in the knowledge that I've built up over the past 25 years.
I think that's something that I personally see quite regularly is it's so difficult and I have a lot of sympathy for marketers, whether it's within a brand, within a media company, within an agency, but it's so difficult to balance looking at what's going on specifically in your category with your direct competitors. What you were saying before, going down the rabbit hole to look at the very, very minutiae of detail, and also have this understanding of just what's actually going on in the world and how does what's going on in the world trickle down to affect what we're actually doing here. So, yeah, I think it's such a difficult balance to strike, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's only 24 hours a day. And, a good amount of those you would hope that people spend sleeping. So you're absolutely right. It's really, really hard to just look at everything. I mean, it's just keeping track of everything and then analysing and then working out what it actually means. And that's what we realised from my view of looking at the sector. And again, because I come from a different background, because I come from a finance background, there's an element there of outsider looking in, but also as well with knowledge of the sector. And what I realised when particularly looking at the sector, what it missed was that bigger picture view of the trends that are coming down the line and therefore could impact the sector. And the thing with that is that, quite frankly, these are sorts of things that, as you say, people don't think about them until they start to be a problem. And, often by then it's too late.
Yeah, and I guess half the challenge is knowing what to pay attention to and what not, right? You can't be an expert in everything all the time. But I suppose while we're on this subject then, so you've just mentioned you're, amongst many things, you are founder and managing director of Liberty Sky Advisors. Through that, you primarily provide media and tech analysis and advice to people across creative, advertising, broadcast, media, tech. Now, a lot of people that listen to this podcast will be marketers who are looking to feel their way through what is, I'm going to say, one of the most complicated social, political, economic climates in recent history. I stopped short of saying the most complicated ever because the late 40s were probably worse. But considering the fact that it is so complicated right now, where it's hard to know exactly what's going to go on from one month to the next, I'm not going to ask you what you think is going to change over the course of 2026. Instead, I want to go down a sort of Jeff Bezos line of thinking and ask, throughout 2026, what don't you think is going to change in the world of marketing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think actually a lot of the things that we see today at the end of 2025, start 2026, are pretty much going to remain the same. I mean, agencies are still going to remain central to what advertisers do. People are still going to remain key. Yes, there are going to be roles that will be replaced by AI, and AI will sort of continue to gain traction. But, the fundamental relationship still doesn't change. It shouldn't change with things. I don't think we will see a collapse in any of the traditional media platforms. I think broadcasting will actually have an okay year in 2026, particularly with the World Cup. Again, out of home will be fine. Publishing will again be quite difficult and so forth. The streamers probably have reached a maximum level in terms of penetration. I don't see any significant changes when it comes to the online players. I don't think, for example, we'll see a collapse in search. I think the tech platforms in general will continue to do quite well with their ad spend. So I think all of that, if we look at the sort of media ecosystem, and I think generally the advertising spend, when we look at it from the expenditure levels, will continue to do quite well. And one of the key reasons behind that is I think corporate profitability in 2026 will still remain high. It's corporates who spend on advertising. And a lot of the decisions are driven by the US. And if you look at US corporate profitability over the past 5 years, it's doubled from a dip of $2 trillion to just around $4 trillion. That means that companies have the ability to spend on advertising. And because they're looking at the consumer, that quite frankly, they need to push price increases through to, I think we'll still see that ad spending remain quite strong. If I had to point to an event that I think in 2026 will be defining, obviously people will talk about the amount of spending that's going on AI. I'll go for a different one. And again, it's sort of more of a macro one. It's going to be the influence of the US midterm elections in November 26. And there, it's usually what happens is administrations, they lose control of Congress, or at least of one house. Trump's made it pretty clear that he doesn't want that to happen. And you can already see that he started off his electoral campaign. Now, the point being with that is that a lot of the things that we're seeing at the moment in terms of what's happening in Venezuela, etc., are being influenced by that timetable. But as we get close to the election, the key thing that always determines who does well or not is how the consumer is doing. And so I think what we're likely to see coming through there are really a mixture of policies that will really have a ripple effect all throughout the advertising ecosystem. Some could be positive. For example, what you could see is low interest rates coming through from the US. That will have a ripple effect throughout the world. That will certainly help stock markets. It will feed through to consumers feeling better. You could see some that may be more sort of negative in terms of their implications. There are already signs that, for example, Trump is doing a more interventionist stance when it comes to specific industries. For example, this week, he talked about putting a 10% cap on interest rates for credit cards. You'll get some that, quite frankly, it'll be unknown. And one thing there could be, what's the attitude towards the tech giants? Does there become a more sort of hostile stance? Or does he take the point of view that they drive the stock market and stock market wealth is key to the US consumer, and therefore he doesn't want to do anything about that pre-election? So for me, that's the big defining event for 2026. I'm sure people will be asking on this podcast, well, what implications does that have? But it's this whole ripple down effect that you can get into advertising spend over the next 12 months. So that's really, for me, the event that I would think, look out for and the implications of that.
Now, at the start of that, you mentioned about agencies still being central to the industry and people still being important, which is good for us to all hear. Obviously, with the news last year about WPP and what's going on with the larger network agencies versus what's going on with the independent agencies, do you think there will be any shift one to the other? Do you think there'll be more resilience amongst the larger groups? What do you think will happen in that dynamic between the larger agencies and the independents, if anything?
Well, yeah, again, great question. I think one thing that will drive that is there's a fundamental difference here between the big holdcos and the independents. And that is that the holdcos often have to answer the shareholders, and independents don't. Not listed shareholders. I'm thinking big investors here, they're obvious shareholders. And the point being with that is that it's often investor pressure that will determine corporate priorities. Now, the reason I mention that is that if I look at the sort of holdcos going into 2026, I don't think there'll be a particularly big difference between them in terms of their strategies or their approach. Yeah, I think Publicis still continue to outperform the market. I think Omnicom is dealing with the merger with it into public and what goes on there. And there will be certainly investor pressure to deliver more cost savings than they've set out in their plan. So again, that will have an effect on the agency space. WP for me is the more interesting one. And if you look at the collapse of its share price, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Cindy Rose to at least show some signs that that's reversing out. And that for me is probably the most interesting scenario there. I think something to look out for is, do they try and sort of go more down the tech route, or do they emphasize more about the people and skills that they have in the business? For me, I always think that the holdcos trying to go down being tech players, it's not a good route because that's not their core competency. If you fight on tech,
absolutely,
you will always lose. What you have to focus on is what you're good at, what your strengths are. And that really comes from people and understanding the business and therefore driving the client's needs. 2026, apart from what I said in WP, I don't really see any major changes there. There may be some changes going through in the mid-tier holdcos. What happens, for example, Dentsu's international business? What happens with Avast? What does Stagwell do? But I think generally the same sort of trends that you saw in 2025 will go into 2026, with the possible exception for WPP is sort of where its recovery comes out at. Do we start to see some signs of recovery coming through? I think for me, the independents are by far the more interesting space. And the reason why I say that is because of their business model and because their profits aren't driven by media, which, to go back to the point about shareholders, for the big holdcos is such an important part of their business and delivers the earnings. For the independents, I think there's been a lot more innovation. And I think also as well, because they haven't been able to rely on this media business, in many cases, they've had to go out and actually prove the worth of their creative business and prove that essentially it does add value. And I think anecdotally, you can certainly see the evidence there that the independents are able to charge quite attractive prices for their product because they do have the confidence to actually go out there and say, this is something that actually adds to the value of your business. You therefore should pay for it. And so I think going into 2026, I think the independents, certainly in the UK market, probably elsewhere as well, are going to be the more interesting space. And I think if they can continue that confidence, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for them. Because again, the holdcos are going to be under pressure from shareholders. One area that you could see that coming through potentially is cost cutting, replacement of staff by AI. And that may leave the gap open for some of the independents to take not only smaller clients, but also mid-tier as well. I do think the larger clients, by and large, will stay with the big agency groups. So I don't think we'll see any fundamental change there.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear. And I suppose anecdotally, my role is within a small independent agency outside of London. And what I'm hearing from clients more than anything is they really appreciate being able to have face-to-face regular access with senior people, because I think that's becoming increasingly important for clients who do want to navigate quite complicated times, who do want to find their way through lots of changes, is having that direct access to somebody who has been in the industry for 10 years, 20 years. But I think there's maybe a temptation sometimes amongst the larger businesses to move very fast in one direction and forget maybe what clients really do value at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is not sort of breaking news. I've written before on this in campaign. This is particularly where I see with WPP. I think the sort of alignment with Google on WPP Open, you can definitely see the advantages. The risk is, of course, is that you over-focus on the technology side and the people side gets neglected. And I think, again, it comes back to this point. If the role of agencies essentially becomes about a technology arms race, then the agencies will lose. It's as simple as that. There needs to be a focus very much on the contribution of people. It's the skills, it's the knowledge, it's what they bring. I always say with AI that AI will essentially deliver you average, may give you average good, may give you average bad. What it won't give you is exceptional.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I know System 1 have done tests where they've proven that you can easily make an average ad with AI. It's very difficult to make an above average ad with AI.
Yeah, it's exactly it. I mean, at the end of the day, there is a lot of work that is average. Yeah, it's as simple as that. And there's a lot of work. I mean, we've seen this, for example, in translation services, already taken a hit with AI simply because it could be done quite easily. But I think, again, to sort of reiterate this point, if an agency thinks it can do its work with AI, as you say, it will only produce an average product. And if it produces an average product, that's a commoditized product. And the commoditized product has no value in the market. What does have a value in the market and what sort of companies will pay for, clients will pay for, is something that's exceptional and delivers value. And that cannot, certainly at the moment and probably for the foreseeable future, cannot be given by AI.
Brilliant. Yes, agreed. Now, Ian, I think you have a few soapboxes, I think it's fair to say. But one that, I mean that in the best possible way. But one that interests me in particular is the need for marketers to speak the language of the boardroom. And you mentioned before you have a finance background, you're possibly the best placed person to talk about this. But if we were to assume that every marketer has heard this enough to go, actually, yeah, I agree, I'm going to start trying to speak the language of the boardroom. What do they need to start doing? And maybe more importantly, what do they need to stop doing in order to achieve that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the second part of that is as important as the first, if not sort of more important. So I think, what I always say to marketers is, look, you need to understand what are the pressures on board, CEOs and CFOs that are coming through. And that pressure, CEOs and CFOs, they have a boss. It's the board, but ultimately it's shareholders and investors. So you really need to know what those investors are thinking about the company. What are the sort of things they look at, the financial results? What's the company's strategy? When you think about the company's strategy, I mean, things like the annual report are a great source of information. They're long, they're big, takes a while to go through, but it tells you so much about what a company sees about its position and its position relative to its competitors as well. And then what you say, I mean, I don't want to give away too much in this because I do run a training course on this. So,
yes.
I don't want to give away all the secrets. But what we'll say is that by understanding the business and the pressures that boards face, then what you can do is you can tie that in to what marketing can offer and see where the links are and say, okay, if this company needs to do this. Also as well, there's an element there of looking out for the warning signs. If a company is coming under pressure on profits, the first place it looks to cut is marketing spend because it's easy and it drops straight through to the bottom line. So again, you can look out for those warning signals and say, what do I need to do here to make the arguments of why marketing spend shouldn't get cut, or at least those cuts are mitigated. In terms of what they shouldn't do, I think, you've got to bear in mind that there's fewer CEOs and CFOs who are coming from a marketing background. There's been some changes to that recently, which is good. But, there has been a tendency for CFOs to go up into the CEO role. And therefore, the knowledge that they will have at marketing may be quite limited. And quite frankly, the amount of time that they've got to spend on it is also quite limited as well. And I think one of the big problems for me anyway, with marketing at the moment, is that it can seem very much like a black box to outsiders. And I would say that for many marketeers, maybe what they've done is over-focus more on the quantification and data side and actually forgotten sort of what is the end goal of marketing, which is the end of the day is actually to grow sales in a profitable way and therefore boost company profits.
I think it's quite interesting where you think about this idea of speaking the language of the boardroom. I almost think it makes it sound like it's a change to language, whereas I almost think it's a bigger thing where if you're doing the marketing job right, if marketing is seen as being more than just comms, if you are involved in discussions around all of the 4 Ps, then you will naturally be speaking the language of the boardroom and you'll naturally be thinking at that level, won't you?
Yeah, and I think it's like, there's an element of translation that needs to go on. I mean, I look at the conversations that marketers sort of speak about and see the presentations and so forth. What's clearly lacking in a hell of a lot of cases is actually the end result for client sales. I mean, to give you an example, we have a situation in the UK where the UK is probably nearly 80% digital advertising. And from a marketeer standpoint, there's the emphasis on return on investment and, sort of go down the tracks of saying, okay, it needs to be more measured, needs to be more sort of accountable and so forth. And yet for many company CEOs, CFOs, they look at the conversations around marketing and then they look at their own sales and say, well, we're not actually seeing that much in the way of extra growth. They're not really seeing this coming through. Now, what is interesting is if you look at the one time where CEOs and CFOs actually did say, we can see a direct correlation here between what advertising has done and sort of our top line growth, was in the 2022-2023 inflation crisis, when they had to push through very significant price increases, often several years worth within the space of 18 months. Their pricing models were telling them they couldn't get that through, and yet they did more. And this was entirely by accident. But what CEOs and CFOs recognized there was the strength of their brands that enabled them to do so. There you had a direct correlation between what advertising does and then therefore how it contributes to the top line and profitability. For me, if I was a marketer, I would talk far less about the latest gadget, sort of endless talk about quantification, and focus on the end results. And it sort of goes on to, I think, to a wider point. It's an issue when talking to boards, but also as well as an issue for the wider industry. CEOs, CFOs are people. People like narratives. And it's a narrative that essentially should lead, and the data should be in a supporting role.
Yeah. I mean, the irony of being a marketer as well, right? Even if we're just focusing on the comms side, we should be able to craft a narrative and tell a story and hold attention, because they're the very basics of what we're employed to do.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's exactly the ultimate irony here. For an industry that is built on essentially crafting a message and selling it to consumers, by and large, it's generally been bad at selling its product to its customers, who are the CEOs and the CFOs of boards. Obviously, there are exceptions, but by and large, that's the case.
You're here ultimately because you want to banish something from the marketing industry. So let's get into that. Now, what would you like to lock in Marketing Room 101 forever? What would you like to banish, please?
I mean, I would call it the overquantification of the advertising industry.
Okay.
I think that the whole of the marketing industry has really gone down a rabbit hole when it comes to this. The sort of view I always have on this is many of the conversations I hear when it comes to marketing are really like the old medieval sort of theological debates about how many angels you can fit in a pinhead. It's that sort of micro detail that, quite frankly, for the real world doesn't have that much interest, particularly for CEOs and CFOs. But I think more in general, what I would say is that the industry risks over-focusing on the data. And again, sort of not focusing enough on the narrative and where it fits into the overall bigger picture of things. And the sort of analogy that I always like to give here, the example I always like to give here is actually a military one. It's in the Vietnam War. There's a concept that's called quantification fallacy, but it's also known as the McNamara fallacy. And Robert McNamara was the US Secretary of Defense sort of at the start of the Vietnam War for most of the 1960s. And he came up with a concept that the way that the Americans could sort of measure success in Vietnam was simply through numbers. That they would have how many enemy soldiers had been killed, captured, how many villages had been sort of destroyed and so forth. And that's what drove the whole of the American strategy for much of the 1960s and the Vietnam War. Now, that was an absolute disaster. And the reason why it was an absolute disaster, part of it was because there was so much data that was being produced that essentially the Americans just couldn't keep up with it. Part of it as well was because the data wasn't being analysed properly, and that was a reflection of sort of the first comment. But much of it had to do with what happened was the Americans lost sight of their bigger goal. There's a great anecdote with McNamara that one of his generals sent him a letter saying, look, we're losing this war because we're losing the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And McNamara apparently tore that piece of paper up and said, hearts and minds don't matter because we can't measure it. And that's exactly the sort of what seems to be happening throughout a lot of the advertising industry at the moment. There seems to be a view that if you can't measure it, it doesn't really matter. Yep. And the focus has become very much, let's call it the process, rather than the end result. And that's what I'd like to see banished, that sort of approach that the industry has got into, where it really sort of concentrates on what can be the possible things and trying to measure to the nth degree. that ultimately doesn't count. I go back to the comment before about what really sort of brought home to CEOs and CFOs the importance of marketing was the inflation crisis of 2022, 2023. The key thing to concentrate on is the end result. What shouldn't be overly focusing on is the process. The process is there to help drive the end result, but it should not be the focus of most people's time.
Yeah. I think that Vietnam example is fascinating because it's so accurate when we apply it to our own industry, isn't it? If you look at what's happened since possibly mid-2000s, when tech and the digital world started to take hold of emphasis from the older creative shops, and you think, actually, we went towards favouring what was more measurable. We lost the conversation about what was more effective by obsessing over what was more measurable, didn't we? There's kind of what you just touched on there. And I think we were talking before the start of this about our sort of shared frustration with the idea of something being data-driven. And I think that's very pertinent to your point here. It's one of my personal bugbears is you can be data-powered or your data can be your fuel. But if there's nobody in the driving seat actually interpreting that data and using that data and looking at what that data contributes to as an end result, then you could be driving in any direction.
Oh, absolutely. And it could sort of ultimately lead you down the wrong path. And actually, in some ways, I'd argue it's even more dangerous than that because, data is the new fuel. That's actually a great analogy where people talk about data as the new oil. What gets missed sort of with that analogy is you can't just take oil out of the ground and put it in a car. It's got to be extracted. It's got to go through a refinement process. It's then got to be split into its various components. And then it's got to be decided which type of fuel goes with which particular product. There is the whole sort of process that goes from the refinement from the extraction, but purely on the refinement, making sure that the right oil goes to the right place. Whereas what I tend to find with this whole conversation with data is people just go, oh, well, the data's there. Well, actually, no, because I'll give you sort of an analogy here from when I worked in finance. In finance, what you get when you're covering a stock is, and it's the law, companies cannot give exclusive access to investors or selected analysts or investors. The law will come down on them quite heavily on this. But you have a stock, you have a company, there could be 25 analysts covering a stock. They will have access to the same data, the same guidance, the same historics, everything the same. And they will come out with 25 different interpretations of that. Because, what people realize is data can be looked at in different ways. And the problem becomes that when you start to say, data-driven, is that essentially what that suggests is too much goes into the data side of things, not enough into the analysis side of things.
And it's so easy, isn't it? You see it with political campaigns all the time. You can take data, apply a subjective analysis of that data to create a seemingly objective argument. I suppose that's where, if we tie this back to the world of advertising, marketing, communications, it'd be interesting to think how can the traditional media catch up with modern media in terms of how they can create their own arguments, how we can monitor effectiveness of all media on an equal playing field so that we can actually go back to having a more objective view of which media we choose for which scenarios, as opposed to it just being who has the best argument created from the most data.
Yeah, and look, again, this is not just the advertising industry. I'd say a lot of the media industry in general, traditional platforms, they've fallen into the trap of, I'm not saying the online platforms are an enemy, but they've fallen into the trap of fighting on the enemy's battlefield. So one thing that I think the agencies, also as well other parts of the media sector need to do is they need to focus on what are their core competencies and don't try and get into a race in technology. Sure, use technology, but don't make it all about technology. What is it exactly you, as an agency, or could be a broadcaster or whatever, what is it the specifics of the skills that you bring? For me, an agency should have a lot of value because the insights you bring into sort of the consumer and then also as well being able to sell a product to the consumer have a direct contribution to a firm's bottom line. That's the area where essentially should be focusing on. If you think about sort of an agency's core competency of that also opens up potentially new revenue streams. But what you shouldn't do is actually sort of say, we should go down the technology route and so forth. So that's one. And the second thing which is related to that as well is, I think one of the big problems for the whole of the agency space, and indeed for a lot of traditional media space, is it needs to regain its confidence. It's lost confidence in the value of its own product. And I think, again, the tech platforms are extremely good at pushing a message, but also as well, they're extremely confident about of the worth of what they do. And one of the byproducts of that is that much of traditional media has become almost like it's a state of apology.
Yeah, it's on the back foot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all on the back foot. And if you're on the back foot, you'll never win. Delving back into the history quotes, Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, who often gets quoted because of his art of war. But one of the comments in that is that the easiest way to defeat an enemy is to convince the enemy they've lost before the battle has started. And that's what we actually see across like a lot of, to a degree, the agency and marketing space, also as well what we see in platforms like the broadcasters. They believe that essentially they've lost the platforms and therefore that determines their actions. And therefore that loss becomes in many ways self-fulfilling. Yet there is a lot of value that agencies, marketeers can bring and at the risk of boring the audience. Go back to the inflation crisis. Look at how companies said it was the strength of our brands that enabled us to push these price increases through. That is an extremely powerful tool. And I would argue also as well, it's at least opened the door to marketeers to explain the worth of their product. That's the area that marketeers need to focus on.
I think this bridges the 2 points that you've made today. So we need to get better at quantifying brand value in a way that is understood in the boardroom. Because the second people open their mouths, I think, and start talking about we need to invest in brand, you can see the glazing over eyes in the boardroom because what does that mean? It's reduced price sensitivity. Okay, let's start talking about how we can reduce price sensitivity by investing in brand. We start to think about how can we apply the language of the boardroom to this challenge, and let's get away from this overquantification. And instead, let's think about really focusing on creating a narrative and a story around the things that really matter to investors and shareholders.
Yes, I worked in finance. You can't measure everything.
Yeah.
Right? The finance industry is the ultimate industry that goes around money. And however much billions they poured into it, they would all say you cannot predict a share price. You cannot, based on you can try, but there are so many different factors that goes in. And quite frankly, there are so many unknowns in many cases that needs to be taken into account. And yet when looking at the advertising industry, it seems as though it's on this quest for the Holy Grail, that if you spend X, you will get Y. And there's some sort of scientific calculation that goes from that. I think a lot of that, again, it's really, I think the tech platforms for themselves have done an absolutely great job. But I think what has been fundamental to their success has been what they've done is they've changed the advertising industry's perception of what advertising actually is. And they changed it from an art to being a science. Well, coming from finance, I could tell you that valuation is generally seen as an art, not a science. There are obviously formulas that you can plug in. But essentially, when it boils down to it, to go back to this point before, 25 analysts will cover the same stock with the same information, and I'll come up with 25 different views. When I used to go into meetings with investors, we'd spend 5 minutes maybe discussing my output. Yeah. But the other 55 minutes of that meeting would be going through what were the drivers, how I'd come to my assumptions. Were those assumptions solid? Had I actually put enough thought into them? Had they been tested? And that was really where the focus is on. I'd say maybe one of the things that, again, is looking from the outside, it is your marketeers. They'll see a new piece of research and they'll focus very much on the result. They'll say, well, look, we found a new piece of research that says if you spend this, you will get this sort of return. The CEO and CFO will look at that and say, okay, so what? I know that any model can be manipulated to give me the outcome I want. What I really want to know is how strong your assumptions are grounded. And if I believe that they are strong, and I believe that actually you've done the work on this, I'll probably feel confident enough to give you your budget.
Ian, I am completely convinced by your argument to banish let's call it the overquantification of the advertising industry. And I'm going to lock it in here in Marketing Room 101. Before you go, would you like to bring anything back into the marketing world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what marketers need to realize is they have a proper place at the boardroom table. But I think to do that, what they need to regain a proper appreciation of business. I would almost argue that they need to move up the value chain. In my mind, marketers, if they get it right, can probably move more valuable than management consultants when it's actually saying to companies the direction of their business. Because the big advantage they have is they actually know the consumer and they know what sells to consumers. And for many industries, that's the ultimate driver of their revenues. So that's what I'd like to see being brought back.
It's quite an interesting thing you're saying there, because my job is to try and have that consultative relationship with clients. And I can say firsthand that the most effective work we produce is always when you are allowed into the business, into those conversations, when you're allowed access to the MD, the CEO. That always it's never not led to making better work, and also get into that work faster, because you therefore know what the business is. You might like to know what the business is looking for or what the big challenges are. So yeah, I 100% agree with that idea of understanding the client's business better.
Yeah, and I think I would say the work needs to be done on both sides. This is not just what marketers need to do. CEOs, CFOs also need to do work as well. As I said, post-inflation crisis, I think it sort of has helped a lot in establishing the value of brands. But there's still, I would say, a tendency amongst many company managements to sort of see marketing as an area that they don't really understand sort of fully about. So boards need to do more themselves, because it is a critical part of the business. But definitely for marketers, there is a better way to selling their product than they're doing at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. Okay, so you can have that back and you can take that and you can go around every organization in the country and help their marketers get a proper understanding of the client's business. You can probably throw a couple of your training courses in there as well to help them understand the wider context. Very finally, before you go, I do want to ask you this week's brother's question. So each episode, my brother, who doesn't work in the industry, comes up with a question for my guest. And this week, he wanted to ask you, Ian, as I understand it, you have an interest in history and war history in particular. How likely do you think it is that the next couple of years will be studied by future war historians?
I think, there's very few periods of history that get totally neglected. So they're always going to be studied. I think, famous last words, I think this is probably going to be studied more than most. The reason why I say that is because if I look at the world, I think the world is sort of on one of those maybe 40, 50 years changes that you get. And what I mean by that is we've had pretty much a sort of economic consensus that's been driven by Reagan and Thatcher. Yeah, and that has now broken down. The sort of free trade, liberal economics, the markets know best, business knows best. That's now been replaced with Trump, which essentially is a lot of a traditional what you'd call mercantilist policy, but also as well bringing back into the realm of international politics, the whole idea of might is right, but also as well an element of proving what used to be called in history, and it's not being sexist, the great man theory, that individuals can actually have an oversized influence on world history. And I think what future generations, I suspect, will look back at and will just realize that actually this was the time when the world order that people had built up post the end of the Cold War has ended. And now essentially we are in a world where it is more like a pre-World War I playing field, where you had then the UK and Germany vying for dominance with the US on the sidelines. Now, of course, it's the US and China. And the pre-World War I analogies, again, it is interesting because that was also a time as well where you had very big political disruption. The rise of, talk about reform and the populist right, sort of, and indeed now the populist left. But, pre-World War I, you had the rise of socialist parties. That was the time, when Labour started to put down roots and so forth. You had a lot of concern about the working model. Again, there was a lot of concern about technological process and change, et cetera, et cetera. I think when sort of future generations look back, they'll see what's happening now as very much one of those pivotal changes that sort of happened in the world. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Yeah, potentially concerning, but we'll try and not end it on such a sour note. But it's a brilliant answer to a very random question, so I thank you for that.
Not at all.
And I suppose time will tell, won't it? Now, how can people get in touch with you, Ian? How can they find out about Bigger Picture, about Liberty Sky Advisors, and how can they get in touch?
The best thing, I'm on LinkedIn. You can search for me and then just send me a message. If you want to chat, more than happy to chat. Could take it from there. It might be that you need something and sort of we can then see what we can do.
Are you open only to chats about marketing, tech and media, or do you also include chats about war history within that?
No, funny enough, I've done a lot of, I do a lot of speaking events, whether presentations or after dinner speeches and so forth. And obviously, just given my expertise, I will talk a lot about what's happening in the media and tech industries. But also as well, a lot of these events have also been saying about what's happening in the wider sort of macroeconomic and geopolitical standpoint. But I always do it with then coming back to what's it therefore mean for your business. So let's call it that people would get to for the price of one.
Amazing. Ian, thank you very much for coming in.
Not at all. Thanks very much, Ben.
So that was my conversation in Marketing Room 101 with Ian Whittaker. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, I'd love it if you could please share it with just one other person who you think would like it too. And if you've done anything recently to feel guilty about, for example, if you accidentally put your partner's wool jumper on 60 wash, then pleaded ignorance the next time she tried it on and it didn't fit, then you can cancel out that bad karma in just 30 seconds by giving Marketing Room 101 a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, if you'd like to arrange a free chat about how I and the Principles team can help grow your brand, just find me on LinkedIn under my name, Ben Norman. And if you'd like to know more about Principles, just head to principlesagency.co.uk.